Here. Hey, Zach, let me unmute you. Or Zach, are you unmuted?
Hey, how's it going? You guys got a full team here.
Yeah, we're just getting there. Other people are rolling in. We'll give it a minute or two. It's a long time no see.
Yeah.
You got to, are you, but where are you at with the green screen? Normally you don't have a green screen, or do you now?
I do now. I just don't have an image up on it. I didn't see if, I guess I could probably put one up. Um,
Oh, you don't have to. This video, you remember, well, I know you know how to do it.
Throw up our HPO background maybe.
There you go. Good advertising for HP. All right. Well, so what we'll do, Zach, is I'll just introduce you. I mean, there may be a few people here that don't know who you are. I suspect most do, but and then we'll get into some like Q&A type stuff. So for you,
Cool.
Zach is a world record holding power lifter. He's squatted. No, Zach is an ultra runner. He is a current world record holder for 100 miles in both trail and track. I think your trail time, I say your track time was something like 11:19, if I'm not mistaken.
19, yeah.
Yeah, so it was like a 6:47 mile for 100 miles, just a minor accomplishment, nothing too hard. Anyway, I probably have to do. I started messing around with some CrossFit stuff, Zach. So
Yeah, I saw that.
just figuring out how to make me my monkey arms, figure out how to do handstand push-ups and all that.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
just,
Is a long arms a disadvantage for
oh
CrossFit? It's
my God.
probably for
Yeah.
some events, but maybe good for others, or I
Yeah. I
don't
mean,
know.
it's you look at the statistical analysis of the guys that do well at CrossFit, and like at the very elite levels, it's almost, you never see anybody over about 6'2".
Okay.
So one, most of the champs are all 5'9", 5'8", something like that. So
Like NFL running back kind
yeah,
of physique.
I'm in a tremendous, leverage disadvantage. But the only thing is, as you get older and older, the people that stay in shape, the cohort gets smaller.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got some advantages in other areas that are pretty decent. But all right, well, welcome, Zach. I'm gonna see, let me see if I can find the chat here. See if anyone has a question. So Zach is obviously a accomplished runner. He's been doing this on a low carb diet. He's not fully carnivorous, but he does eat a lot of meat, and I think at times Zach does practice, carnivore, particularly for recovery. At least that's much. What I'll let you say it, Zach. Tell
Sure.
your current dietary strategy just in general, and then how much meat you eat and when you use it and how you've been using it.
Yeah, no, it's I think you're pretty much right on. I've been kind of in the high fat, low carb camp more or less from a nutritional strategy for a little over 8 years now. And I've kind of tailored it a little more to my lifestyle. And where it gets a little more complicated with me, I think, is my lifestyle has so much variance in terms of what changes. Like if I'm in kind of peak training, that phase of my year is drastically different than when I'm kind of in off season or recovery versus what like most folks are going to kind of have their routine and they're going to be pretty consistent with it. And it's just the their off time and their on time aren't going to be drastically as different as mine, where the way I kind of describe it is when I'm in peak training, I'm kind of feeding 2 to 3 of me in terms of energy output. But then when I'm recovering, I'm feeding myself at rest essentially. So I'm kind of working in a little bit more of a moving target than I think most people are. So the way I've kind of structured my high fat, low carb diet has been where my carbs do kind of ebb and flow a little bit depending on where I'm in training, with like the easy day, like the easy recovery phases are very low, ketogenic low, almost zero carb at times. And then peak training, I'll flex it up to maybe like 20 to 30% of my intake sometimes when I'm like really getting after it, upwards to 20 plus hours a week of running and strength and mobility type stuff. And then everywhere in between, kind of depending on where I am, because those are the two extreme ends to it. And for the last 8.5 years almost now, I've essentially adopted kind of the same kind of macronutrient ranges for that. And the biggest change I've made, I guess, would have been in the last kind of year and a half to almost 2 years, where even though my macronutrient ranges look pretty similar to what they would when I kind of first started, I've just kind of skewed a lot more of that stuff towards animal products. So like fatty cuts of meat, dairy, fish, I'll eat chicken and turkey and things like that too sometimes, although those are probably the minority, a lot of eggs and things like that. So Yeah, I mean, even when I'm in kind of my higher, or when my carbs are at their highest, I should say, there's still a pretty dominant portion of my food intake coming from animal products. And then, like Sean mentioned, if I finish like a big race or a big training block and I have a phase of recovery or even complete off season, that's when maybe I'll flex in more of a like kind of stricter carnivore approach. Partly just because when I'm doing a race, if I do like a 100-mile race, that's when I'll be taking in like food fuel sources that I'm not typically doing on a frequent basis. So like it is kind of a little bit of a trade-off from a digestive standpoint. Like there's nothing about racing 100 miles all out and trying to fuel that is necessarily like an advancement in your health. You're kind of like fighting a little bit of an uphill battle, if anything. And then the key to it to make it sustainable, I think, is just being good about the recovery side. So when I finish those races, I'll spend a week or two where I'll kind of flex in just a pretty strict carnivore or animal-based product strategy with a lot of fatty cuts of meat and that sort of stuff.
So we've got, let's see, Cassie says, I'm 2 months into carnivore. I'm started jogging during my third week. I have activity-induced asthma and tight hip flexors. I'm up to 2.2 miles of combination run walk, 70-30 run. Any advice since you have coached new carnivores that are just starting back with exercise? I'll be doing a rock and roll 5K in San Francisco on April 5th. Anything you think, Zach?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I have a couple coaching clients right now that are stricter carnivore than I am anyway. Some of them, most of them usually don't follow a 100% kind of Sean Baker ribeye only type of an approach. But I've got one gal right now who's actually a dietitian, and she's mostly carnivore. She'll bring in some berries and things from time to time, but very little outside of the animal-based products. And what she notices and what we notice is in her training is she just gets a little strategic about it. So early on, I think you can probably just kind of stay the course if you're following a strict carnivore diet. I don't see a huge reason to like maybe be playing around with trying to bring anything outside of that in those early stages while you're still kind of building up your volume and kind of doing that 70-30 walk run. What you might notice is if you kind of you get kind of a little further along your journey with endurance, that there may be some use for some well-timed, carbohydrate sources from a purely performance side of things. If your goal isn't to try to like execute a race and kind of finish it completely exhausted and know that you got every last second out of yourself, then you can likely do it without that. And depending on the distance, you might be able to anyway. I think it's still a little kind of fuzzy where things are with that. And the distance and the intensity is going to kind of play a role too. So is that kind of what you're asking, more along the nutrition side of things, or were you curious about kind of training methodology or anything like that? Or
Well, I'll have to wait to hear back from Cassie on that. Here's another one from Carl. What do you recommend for strength training for endurance running? I'm focusing now on high intensity compound weightlifting to maintain and even increase muscle mass, which is severely impacting my running in a negative way. Yeah, you're getting heavier makes it harder to run. Imagine that.
it can, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think you want to keep around the heavy compound lifts. I think that's where the kind of research has gone for even like really long endurance events. And part of that is just because, especially when you get into the world of like kind of elite track and field and marathon type runners, their work is so one dimensional in that like their mechanics are pretty routine because they're typically training for flat environments versus, a lot of the folks that are in the ultra running world where they're going up and down mountain passes and canyons, a lot of times they're getting a lot of strength work just from running up steep terrain. Whereas, someone more like myself or like some of these elite endurance athletes for flatter surfaces, they're becoming like quad dominant, posterior chain is getting weak, like glute activation can become an issue, things like that. So you can kind of counter that a little bit in the weight room. And I think you want to actually, a lot of endurance athletes will kind of naively go to the gym because they think they're supposed to, and they'll just grab like the 10-pound dumbbells and be like doing 100 rep curl type things. And that's kind of counterproductive in my opinion, just because that's essentially doubling down on what you're already doing. So think of it as like kind of you're trying to address your weakness, not try to, fine tune your strength. when you're in the weight room. So that would mean like low rep, high weight relative to what you can tolerate on like things like squats, deadlifts. I'm trying to remember, I think was it Randy Hauer that we had on the podcast, Sean, who worked with a lot of strength work with the endurance athletes. And he said if he had to recommend one lift, if he had a client said, I can do one thing and I've got like 10 minutes a day, what should I do? And he said a kettlebell swing is the one that's going to hit on most of the stuff for endurance athletes from a strength component. So if you want to start somewhere, that's probably a good spot, is to kind of learn how to do a proper kettlebell swing and kind of work that into the rotation. I'll add that when it comes to strength work and endurance training programs, since this is a secondary activity, you do want to be careful that it's not negatively impacting your primary activity. So what I see sometimes people kind of make a mistake is they'll have like a structure in their endurance training plan where it'll be like kind of like hard, easy, hard, easy, hard, easy as their kind of rotation through their running. And they'll end up they'll think, okay, well, I'll go to the gym on my easy day or my rest day. And they'll do some heavy weightlifting or something like that on their easy rest day from running. And essentially what they end up kind of doing a lot of times in that framework is they're not giving themselves like a recovery day. Then they're kind of always hard in some capacity. They're just kind of juggling back and forth between what the mechanic of that hard is. So usually when I'm working with someone, what we start with is if you have like say you do like Tuesdays and Thursdays, you do something that's a little more high intensity from the running standpoint. You're doing like short intervals or like a tempo run or something like that. Those tend to be good days to also do the strength work. So you're kind of keeping your hard days hard and your easy days easy.
Yeah, I'll just add that when it comes to, strength versus putting on muscle size, typically the lower rep ranges are going to provide more strength. Lower rep high weights are going to give you more strength and less muscle, like a hypertrophy work, which would be kind of higher volume stuff. So we've got Cassie's follow-up about the nutrition. She said she's going to stay strict carnivore, so she's not planning on doing long distances, I guess, because she was the one who was talking about the 5K.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Consider adding collagen gelatin or glucosamine. Are you messing with any of those? I know glucosamine has largely fallen out of favor among orthopedic surgeons because the results seem not to work in humans, but I'll see what your thoughts are on that, Zach.
Yeah, I haven't gone out of my way to add any of that stuff. The closest I think I've gotten to that is like just bone broth and stuff, I suppose, would be like kind of a similar approach maybe. But I actually look at that stuff more from the electrolyte side of things, like especially when it gets to be summertime here in Phoenix. The number of fluids that I'm going through and the salty foods that I'll crave is pretty high. So sometimes it's easier to get in some of those electrolytes through like a salty beverage, like a bone broth or something like that. So that's usually kind of like my primary target with that, not necessarily looking at building anything with like the connective tissue side of stuff. I think it was it Stu Phillips, I want to say, Professor Stu Phillips, who said, or was pointing some research that said a lot of that stuff doesn't show any advantage from a structural standpoint, and it's likely more tied to getting in enough protein in terms of keeping some of those areas strong. I could be wrong about that, but I believe it was him who said something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't remember if it was Stu or not, but I mean, that's, like I said, there are, you can, so hydroxyproline, hydroxylysine, there are actual gut transporters that will take those things up directly, but I still think the majority of probably your collagen synthesis is going to come from, getting the amino acids, anyway, and just from eating high protein. I think you're likely correct on that, but I can't remember if Stu said it or not. Here we go. This is a good one from Terry. If you wanted to occasionally add a small amount of carbohydrate around workouts, weights, and or cardio, what sources of carbs would you recommend? And I'll just throw in there, can you discuss timing of that too, Zach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, timing is is probably the driver. So if you think of it like, if you decide you're going to reintroduce carbohydrates, say the night before a session in the morning, I think you probably want to stay closer to things that are kind of a little slower release, like maybe like a sweet potato or something like that, Whereas if you're going to do it kind of closer to like in or around the workout itself, that's where you can maybe get away with a little of a faster acting source. And that maybe be a little more impactful since you're looking to kind of have it be an immediate effect versus an effect down the road. So for me, the way I kind of do it is like, I don't usually like to do my workouts with a whole lot in my stomach. So if I'm going to do something prior to or during a workout, I usually stick to something that's a little more like quick digesting, easier to digest. And that can be something, if I'm looking for kind of a more of a whole food option, like something like raw honey, maybe like a handful of berries or something like that. And then intra workout, I'll use a product that's just basically a powder you mix in with your water. So sometimes it just depends on how like engineered you want to get with it. If you're trying to avoid like engineered fuel sources like sports drinks and things like that, then there are kind of workarounds with that, with like the honey and things is something I've seen people do. Like real maple syrup sometimes is something people will do. Those both do tend to be a little slower release. So from my experience, what I've noticed, if I use that versus say an engineered sports product, like I don't feel like it gives me like as an immediate of a pop, which could be good or could be bad depending on what you're trying to do with that workout. And then kind of back to what I was saying originally, if it's like something where I'm going to do a big workout in the morning and I want to wake up and just kind of have a cup of coffee and then hit the road and I don't want to eat a whole lot, then I'll usually kind of put some of those carb sources in that meal, that last full meal I had. And then I'll be doing something more like a sweet potato, maybe some berries and melons or something like that if I'm feeling like that more than I am the kind of starchy stuff. So that's usually the timing. And then usually the only time I'm focusing on carb post exercise is if I have something coming up short thereafter. So if I do a hard workout and then I have a couple days where it's like really easy or recovery, I won't necessarily bring any carbohydrates back after the workout, even though by doing it that way, it is going to be increase its likelihood to end up as in your muscles as muscle glycogen. But if I'm not doing something short thereafter, I'll just let that kind of process take place through just the proteins and fats I would normally eat. But if I do have like a big training session and some folks are doing like these kind of block training methods of endurance, where rather than kind of what I was saying before with like kind of a hard, easy, hard setup, you're actually doing like maybe hard, hard, then easy, easy, or hard, 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 and then kind of easy, easy, easy. So you're kind of blocking the intensity in a tighter window. And the idea behind that is you're getting a more acute stimulus with not increasing the total intensity over time. So you're not adding any additional intensity or any additional work, but you're just kind of hyper focusing it to generate a bigger stimulus from it. And those contexts, I think, is where kind of carbohydrate usage is probably the most advantageous, is because you just have such a short recovery time between sessions. So maybe you're doing something in the morning, then again in the afternoon, or doing something hard one morning and then something hard again the next morning, where it's, kind of a tighter window to be banking on muscle glycogen to get resynthesized from fats and proteins. And I think a lot of that also has to do with the intensity. Where it gets confusing, I think, for a lot of people is when they hear intensity, they a lot of times think like all out. Whereas intensity for like an endurance athlete, a lot of times is just this gray area intensity where it's hard, but it's also easy enough that you can do it for a long time. So you're really susceptible to dipping deep into your muscle glycogen, even if you're like very fat adapted. So you find yourself in this position where you can like basically deplete your glycogen or get very close to depleting your glycogen, but then going on having to do another workout shortly thereafter, that's also going to do that. So in terms of post exercise, like carbohydrate reintroduction, that would be the framework in which I would maybe consider that.
Hey, Zach, there is somebody asked about the reason for adding carbs. I think you addressed that, but when you talk about intensity, have you seen over time that your threshold for higher intensity has gotten higher and higher as you become better and better fat adapted? That is to say, you can run at, a higher pace. I don't know if the VO2 percentage gets higher, but your ability, say a 730 pace for a long period of time before dipping into glycolysis or that type of thing. What's been your experience over the years, and has that changed recently? Because do you feel that adding more meat to your diet has helped you be a better athlete in any way?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, I'm actually going to get some tests done in the next couple of months that is going to look at things like my crossover point where I start burning like equal amount of glycogen to fat and all that stuff and see where it is at. I know last time I had that tested, which was a long time ago, my crossover point essentially got pushed back a little bit. So I had to go a little harder in order to get to that point. And then like my ratios were just higher in favor of fat than glycogen, kind of almost across the board up until you get into essentially an all out effort where you just go completely glycolytic, which it doesn't really matter what you eat when you get that peak intensity. You're going to be, you're not going to be burning fat at that point. Just because it's so intense, but then your muscles are your limiter, not your muscle glycogen. At that point, you're going so hard, failure is going to come far before you deplete your glycogen sources. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. I might have some new interesting data coming soon in terms of where all those numbers lay within the framework of like, at this intensity, I burn X percentage of fat and X percentage of carbohydrate. What I have noticed, and it's hard to tease out sometimes what causes what, because like essentially every year I do this, I'm adding like exposure to like the stimulus that I'm trying to improve, but I've definitely gotten more adapted at being able to run kind of what I would call like a high-end aerobic or a maximum aerobic pace at faster intensities for longer periods of time before you start to see like your pace suffer and you drift out of it by staying at the same heart rate, or your heart rate starting to creep up as you continue the pace you started out at. In terms of looking at it as like, has increasing my meat intake drastically affected like where I'm at with stuff? Again, it's kind of subtle to tease out, but I think where it gets a lot easier is kind of with post-race recovery and post-big stimulus recovery. It's just a lot easier just to like eat a bunch of fatty meat to satiation and then kind of just rest and recover. I think you're just less prone to make a mistake from a digestive standpoint or an inflammatory standpoint when you're doing it that way. So, that I think that that's probably been helpful for me. It's also just really easy to navigate. I mean, people think of like a carnivore approach or a meat-based approach as being like logistically difficult, but it really is logistically easy because you just go into wherever you're going to buy your food and you know what you're going to get. You don't have to really think twice about it. So that's kind of nice when traveling, I think. Recovery, I've again, it's hard to always tease some of this stuff out because you don't know necessarily whether it's, time in sport that's making big improvements or if it's dietary shifts and changes and things like that. But, I do feel like I'm able to put in just as much, if not more work and bounce back from it now as I ever have. And I'm not getting any younger. So I think that's a good sign that the dietary strategies aren't negatively impacting anything from that side of stuff. And if anything, probably promoting recovery. I'm getting about as much protein as any endurance athlete probably is, if not, and then some in a lot of cases. So that maybe has affected things a little bit. Because I'm probably, if anything's changed macronutrient wise in the last year or two, my proteins, I wouldn't say it's necessarily like terribly higher or drastically higher, but it's probably more consistently at like an upper range versus maybe ebbing and flowing a little more.
All right, let me see. There's Carl's got a follow-up question. Would periodization work to separate hit weight workouts from running? In other words, solely weight training for a day, 6 days, say for 6 weeks, and then running the next 6 weeks better than combining both? I guess I would ask about individual workouts, but he's doing 6 entire blocks of running and then 6 entire weeks of hit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would think that if you did a setup like that, you'd maybe be better off putting the running stuff first because depending on what the type of running you're doing, like if you're doing wind sprints, it probably doesn't matter. But if you're going out and actually building like an aerobic base, I actually think that's kind of a good foundation for just about anything. like if you build like a really strong aerobic base, essentially you're just giving yourself a higher ceiling at some of those other systems of training. So if you're going to do something like that, like if your goal is to just get like stronger or better at like the strength stuff, but you want to do some running to help kind of work synergistically with that, but you want to keep them separate, I would do the 6 weeks of running first leading into the strength training stuff, if that kind of makes sense. Is that what he's asking?
Yeah, Carl's shaking his head yes, so I assume
Okay.
that did. And I like to separate that stuff out myself typically. Uh, although I'm delving into CrossFit, it'll be a different thing. See what happens
You're
there.
getting both at that point.
Yeah, traditionally, I've always kind of separated my strength work from my conditioning work, at least uh, from a period of time, or I might put the conditioning work at the end of the workout because then I'm useless from a strength training standpoint. So, um, Stephen is asking, what are your thoughts on Ted Naiman's 15-minute workouts? I don't know how familiar you are with Ted stuff. I mean, I know we had a couple times. It's basically, a couple sets, just all to failure,
Mhm.
uh, once a day or something like that, a few times a week.
Yeah, I mean, I think for like what Ted is trying to angle at, it probably works great. And I mean, it's certainly efficient. Like if you can get all you need out of your exercise in 15 minutes, then that frees up a lot of time for other stuff. And if you have a lot of interests and curiosities, that's probably a win. I don't know how that would translate for what I do. I mean, Ted and I are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum on that, where I'm trying to get myself ready to run 100 miles in a day, and I think he's more or less focusing on health, longevity, and keeping around lean muscle so that he ages gracefully. And it seems like what he's doing, I mean, the proof is probably in the pudding with that, I would say. And Ted seems to be doing quite well. So I think if that's your goal, then it's probably about as sound as anything. And that might be a better question for Sean. I don't know. I mean, Sean, you're not too far from him. I mean, I know there's some differences because you've got some goals competitively wise, but you're not like in the gym for 3 hours a day. You're kind of an hour in, out, right?
Well, typically when I'm trying to get work done, I don't think there's a benefit to going too long now. Like I said, now this silly CrossFit stuff, I got to work on skills. So that
Mm.
learning techniques obviously takes a while. So that's going to be more time working on skill production. But in general, I think it depends on your goals. I mean, Ted is not a big guy. I mean, he's not got a lot of muscle. He's very lean, which arguably might be, some people say that's a better thing instead of, referencing like a guy who's a bodybuilder who's packing on, 50 pounds more muscle than he would naturally carry. And of course, there's a lot of drugs confounding all that stuff. But I, I personally don't find that to be the most effective way to put on muscle for hypertrophy. I mean, I think more of a bodybuilding style, higher volume type of stuff is it just works better because like I said, the guys that are the best at it in the world are the bodybuilders. The way they train, if you want to put on muscle, is the way you should train. And granted, they're all taking drugs and they're all doing all this other, we're talking professional level and stuff like that. So that's probably the if your goal is maximum muscle hypertrophy, then that's how you have to train. If you want to just get stronger, put on muscle, and you don't have a lot of time, then I think Ted's is a that philosophy is also a good way to do it from an efficiency standpoint. And quite honestly, some of us don't have 3 hours a day to spend
Mhm.
in the gym, and so you just have to get in, get out, get it done. I'd rather you be efficient with your time and get it done. Okay, let me get on this one. Stephen asks another question. How do you minimize knee injury risk when running for long distance, Zach? Or I guess it would be, I mean, you can talk about knee mechanics specifically, but I mean, probably just injury in general. I mean, maybe you can address, knee specific and then injury in general.
Sure. Yeah, I think nutrition is probably underrated, or maybe not underrated, but amongst like just like the general person who thinks about preventing injury, they don't always think about nutrition. So, I think you know, being nutritionally sound is probably a great way to stay off the injury table, so to speak, from a holistic standpoint. And that's something I've had a lot of luck with basically since I've been done with college. I had some lower leg injuries and stuff in college that I worked through. But since then I've been basically injury free almost my entire ultra running career, minus one issue I had in 2017. But I think that's big, like getting your nutrition right, getting your sleep right. I think those two things are probably going to be I think bad nutrition and bad sleep are probably what gets runners into the most trouble. Because then they're just not recovering from one session to the next. And now you can compound that by kind of overreaching too often and not doing what I like to say, like micro stressing. So when I build a plan for myself or someone else, we do a pretty good look at kind of where you're at and where you want to be, and then develop a timeline. So like someone who says, if someone came to me and said, hey, I want to be able to run 100 miles a week and do these ultra marathons, and at the point that they come to me, they're running 20 to 30 miles a week, and the furthest race they've done is like a 5K, 10K. I say, okay, let's do it, but let's make sure we're doing it right. So we're not going from, that 20 to 30 mile training week up to like 60 miles in the second week and then 100 in the fourth or something like that. Cause that's just going to get you an overuse injury almost no matter what you're doing otherwise. So that gradual kind of progression, it's a patient person sport for the most part when you're looking to do kind of the higher volume training and things like that. From specific things like knee issues, I think some of that can just be like, a little bit of bad luck. Some folks just, you kind of are on a track to having knee issues almost no matter what they do, it seems like. Whether that's nutritionally related or not is anyone's guess, I suppose, versus kind of just being like maybe genetically like predisposed to being able to have a knee issue versus just having like really robust knees. I think a lot of it, once you kind of get through that, is just like the mechanics of it all. So what you a lot of times see with runners is when you look at where their foot is hitting the ground, a lot of times their foot is hitting the ground out in front of their knee. And what they're basically doing there is they're overstriding, and that overstriding is causing their foot to come down out in front of their knee, which is causing the impact forces to travel up the kinetic chain and into their knees and hips. And that's where they're going to get a lot of those issues like, knee issues, hip issues, IT band issues, things like that are further up on your leg. And the way to kind of avoid that from a mechanical standpoint is to make sure your foot is striking the ground underneath a bent knee. So like our legs are designed perfectly to absorb the impact forces in a way that is less destructive. So if you can work with that as opposed to against it, you're going to have a lot less kind of stress and impact going into the wrong areas. And you can, the biggest tip I can usually give folks to like kind of remedy that or make sure they're doing that right is kind of pay attention to their cadence. So like the cadence is essentially the number of strikes your foot is hitting the ground per minute. And if someone has a really slow cadence, it usually means they're overstriding, because it's hard to get a high number of repetitions in a certain period of time if you're striding out really far. So like the number that a lot of people are targeting is like 180 per minute, where that's a fairly high enough cadence where it's just difficult to be striking out in front of your knee if your legs are moving that fast. I think sometimes it gets a little confusing because people automatically think like, if you heel strike, that means it's bad for you. You're striking out in front. That's not necessarily true. I see some people who are heel strikers, technically speaking, or at least back of their foot strikers. And when you slow down their video and watch where their foot is landing and how it's coming down, and when they bear that weight, it's underneath a bent knee. And that person's probably going to be just fine and not have any issues with it. Versus someone who's up on their forefeet, where they're basically always underneath bent knee, because it's really hard not to be. You can't really be on your forefoot and have your leg out without being really awkward, and you're just not going to naturally run like that. So that's kind of where the whole like heel striker, forefoot, midfoot striker came from. And it's generally true that a forefoot, midfoot striker is going to be better mechanically sound, but it's not necessarily an all or nothing thing either.
All right, Steve's peppering our questions with a good questions. So this is the one about barefoot style trainers. Are they or more protective soles? Which is better? Any differences? Benefits, risks to either or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of people, I'm guessing Steve remembers the minimalist movement when it came through a few years ago, probably almost 10 years ago at this point. And the idea there was that if you eliminate like this foot cast, so to speak, or minimize the foot cast, what you're doing is you're forcing your body to land in a very precise way. So if I take out all the cushion or all the soft surface that my foot can land on, your foot is going to find the most precise spot to land because it just doesn't have a large margin for error. And then when you add the cushion what you do is you make a soft landing point all around your foot. So your foot can strike in ways where it would not normally find comfortable because it has that added cushion or that added comfort built in. So what a lot of times I think you want to focus on is you want to focus on like, well, what are you trying to do? So if you're trying to strengthen lower leg muscles and strengthen your lower leg in general, taking that cushion away and getting a more firm, hard surface to run on is going to do that. But it's just like anything. Those are muscles down there. So like if you go from a highly cushioned, soft running surface to a very hard, responsive running surface too much too soon, it's just like going in the weight room and doing like your routine like 3 times and expecting not to be sore and hurt the next day. So you kind of have to ease into that or micro stress into that as well. What you oftentimes end up doing by kind of going minimalist or going with a more like low profile shoe, a more firm shoe, is that precise landing is going to cause your foot to be coming underneath the bent knee. And that's going to relieve some of the stress that you're going to get in like your knees and hips in that upper leg area. What a lot of people end up noticing is those impact forces are going to occur. They don't go away by landing right, but they just go into other areas. So you want to kind of spread them out in the right way. So if you go like completely barefoot when you're not used to it, you're going to expose those lower leg muscles to a lot of work that they're not used to, and you could potentially get a lower leg injury. So someone who's kind of dealing with lower leg issues, if you have like a lot of foot pain, ankle pain, Achilles tendon pain and stuff like that, sometimes like you might want a more cushioned shoe, at least until you get through that injury or that pain. And then once that kind of subsides, then it might be wise to try to strengthen that area so it doesn't happen again. So that's kind of what I did. Like I mentioned earlier that when I was in college, I had some lower leg injury issues. So when I got out of college and started focusing on some longer events, I kind of knew I needed to strengthen my lower legs. So I spent probably like 6 to 12 months working down into a lower profile minimalist type shoe to get my lower legs really, really strong. And once I did that, I started looking at it more as like a kind of like I like to call it a shoe quiver. So like there are workouts I'll do where I'll use something that's really light, really flexible, really hard, and I'll get my lower leg muscles really good and worked. And then the next day, those might be the part that's a little more sore on me. So if I wake up the next morning and I'm going to go and do kind of like an easy paced run, but like my calves and my feet are a little sore from the day before, then I might put a more highly cushioned shoe on to kind of alleviate that point that's needs to rest or needs to get a little more support on that day. And then I'll kind of go back and forth between the sets, if that kind of makes sense.
This is kind of a follow-up to that, and I'll add my own sort of thing. Carl was just asking about what brand you're using, and I have a pretty good idea you're wearing Ultra. I've got Zach sent me a couple pairs, and I find them super comfortable. I really like the running one, the Escalante, I guess, is just super, super comfortable. But do you spend any time just walking around barefoot, or did you like, because you have kind of a, those tend to be less supportive than maybe some of the other shoes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because there's some people that like they just walk everywhere barefoot, or they're in their Vibrams, and Mark Sissom's doing that. Paul Saladino's walking around barefoot everywhere. Did you spend time doing some barefoot walking around stuff? And then what shoes? Just confirm whether you're using what shoes you're using, I guess.
Yeah. I'll start with the barefoot stuff. I think that's a great way to start, especially like if you've been in like a traditional shoe, which most people have for the majority of their life. You want to think of it like if you had a cast on your arm. So if you had a cast on your arm for like, say 8 weeks and you took it off, the muscles in that area have atrophied. So you got to take some time to ease them back. So you're not going to go and start doing like a high intensity workout with that arm. You're going to start with some basic rehab stuff. So when you think of like foot muscle usage, like walking around barefoot is way more gentle, a lot closer to maybe some like basic rehab type activities that you would see before you actually get into like kind of into the meat of like any type of strength work. So walking around barefoot, I think, is a great way to kind of get your feet used to the mechanics and used to the flexion that you're going to do if you decide to start doing some workouts and that sort of stuff. And then, you can start to gradually increase that by like adding a run in something like that and getting that kind of micro stress to those muscles. For me, I use Ultra footwear partly because when I went through kind of my minimalist phase, or when I was building up that lower leg muscle, I eventually got to a point where I was going to pick a brand to represent as an athlete. And I wanted to find a brand that kind of had a natural product. And I can describe why their stuff is natural, but also had a range of options outside of just purely minimalist, because I do a lot of races, like sometimes on rocky technical mountain stuff, also like tracks, roads and things like that. So like the tools for the environment kind of change from event to event. And Ultra basically offers everything from like kind of a more minimalist, nimble, kind of flat balanced cushion is what they call it, foot shaped toe box structure, all the way up to maximum of that. So whether I'm wearing one of their more maximal cushion shoes or their minimally cushioned shoes, I'm always going to have that balanced cushioning where it's the same on the front as it is in the back. And I'm always going to have that foot shaped toe box, which is just going to let my feet kind of splay out the way they were intended without a shoe there. And then everything in between. So I have a lot more options within that same kind of general philosophy of kind of having your foot do what it would do without a shoe there. But then having the protection from whatever environment you're going to go into, whether that be like paved streets or technical trail and all that sort of stuff.
Zach, somebody's asking about your warm up. What is a typical warm up for you before you go running look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends a little bit. Like when I get into really kind of peak training, it's not as uncommon that I'll have a hard day, like I mentioned before, and then follow it up with another hard day. So those tend to be kind of the ones where I got to be a little more careful. It's a little interesting because it's like you spend more time working out, but then because you do that, you end up having to spend more time like with some of these like tertiary activities like mobility and sleeping and things like that. So you end up kind of paying for it on both ends. When I'm just kind of like slowly building up volume early on and I'm not in peak training, I'll usually just be right out the door and I'll run the first mile, maybe 2 miles at whatever feels comfortable. And then I'll ease into whatever the workout plan is for the day. When I'm getting into those big sessions where, I might hit 150 miles in a training week or something like that. Then I might do a little bit of mobility work before I go out, just so like it's a little more, I'm easing into the running a little bit more, but not a ton, like in terms of a huge routine. Like usually if I'm doing anything outside of just warming up at a slow running pace, it's like maybe 10 minutes of mobility and some light type stretching. If it's going to be like an intense workout, like I'll do some intervals where earlier on in my training block where it's like 3 minutes, basically as hard as I can do it. And for those, that takes a little more of a complex warm up. The way I usually describe it is you never want to be skipping intensities to get to intensities. So like if I'm going to do a really hard paced workout, like a short, fast interval, I don't necessarily want to go from standing still or walking into that intensity. So for that type of a setup, I might start jogging slow. I might do some like short strides to kind of simulate the interval a little bit. And then I'll get into the workout itself. Whereas if I'm just going to go out there and run easy for an hour, hour and a half, there's really no warm up other than just getting out there and starting.
All right. Has your weight, Zach, has your weight changed significantly in the last 2 or 3 years since you've gotten faster? Have you lost, gained body composition? What's happened with that?
Yeah, I would say if we look at like kind of my ultra marathon running career, my weight hasn't changed dramatically. My body composition has. When I first started, I was higher fat percentage than I am now. And even that fluctuates a little bit. Like when I do an off season, I almost intentionally gain a couple pounds just because when I start a training program, like start building up, uh, you know, as I get into kind of like the peak work and stuff, it's nice almost to have a little bit of a reserve rather than having to necessarily fuel to that. So like when I'm in an off season, it's just easier not to kind of restrict uh, versus like kind of eat the way I had been eating. I eat less obviously just because I'm not trying to run like, 20 plus miles a day sometimes, but I don't necessarily try to like stay at my competition weight either. And that kind of helps. Like if I go into like a training program, maybe 2 or 3 pounds heavier than what I will be on race day, it actually kind of makes it a little easier because I don't feel like I always have to be like eating past like what's intuitive for as much of the plan as I would if I entered it. But yeah, I mean, I think, my weight, right, my competition weight is typically right around 140 pounds. That's about where I was in college. I'd usually be between maybe like high 130s to mid 140s. The last couple of years, I've pretty much stayed pretty close to like low 140s. It doesn't, like if I'm right up to a race right after my big training buildup, I might be in like kind of like the high 130 range. And then, after like a few weeks or a month or so of just low to no training, creep up into the mid 140s. But it's a little more, I would say, like, and this maybe actually partly answers that question was asked earlier about like, what do I notice that's different about kind of the higher meat content or animal-based product nutrition. I do notice that like my window is a little tighter. So I'm not kind of having, like when I was high carb, like I could have like a 10-pound weight shift over the course of a day. Like I'd get back from my run if I weighed myself and then I weighed myself again at the end of the day, I'd be like 10 pounds heavier. Some of that's just fluid loss. A lot of that's just fluid loss, but it's also just like, just a way more of a roller coaster, I think, in terms of the way your body responds to like the food choices you're making. Possibly from an inflammatory standpoint. I don't know where the science is at that pro or con or not, but it seems like for me, that I'm able to kind of stay in a little bit of a tighter range without really giving it a whole lot of thought. So that's kind of where I'm at with that, I guess.
Cassie comments that Zach's one of the few long distance runners that has biceps. He doesn't.
Yeah, it's funny because like I'll go when I went on like Joe Rogan, he'll have like guys like Sean on, who are huge. And so people on there are like, oh, look how small this guy is. And then I'm like, look at the other distance runners. I'm actually like probably moderate to maybe even a little above moderate in size for like a distance runner. So I always find that kind of funny.
Let me see, Zach. So, what do you have coming up? What's the next one you got coming up?
Yeah, so I'm actually getting ready for a race in London on April 18th, and it's a 100 miler on a track again. This one drew me in because usually when I'm doing these track short loop 100 milers, the goal there is to like eliminate as many variables as you can by keeping the terrain and the environment consistent, so you can just run fast. And historically, the hardest part is a lot of times the events I'm doing this stuff at are in the context of another event. So they'll be doing like something called like a 24-hour event or a 48-hour event where they're seeing how far they can get in that period of time. I'm out there running for like 12 hours or less in a lot of cases. So I'm just moving a lot faster than the folks who are trying to go for 24 hours. And if it's on a 400-meter track and there's 30, 40 people out there, I've just sit in lane 2 basically all day because I'm going around. And when the field spreads out on a short loop like that, you're basically always passing someone. Whereas this one in London is structured a little more for like 100-mile performances and below. So there'll be maybe 20 people total on the track, and they'll all be kind of targeting a little bit of a faster effort. So I should be able to spend quite a bit more time in lane 1 and hopefully gain a few minutes off of that. But that's kind of the goal there. I'm kind of still, I guess I'm entering kind of my peak training phase for that. So I'm going in with a loose goal of trying to target kind of a sub 11-hour 100-miler for that. So hopefully if all goes well with training and the race day environment is ideal, I can take a swing at cracking 11 hours for 100 miles.
So that would be like 20 minutes below the world record that you already set. That's just a minor.
Yeah. Well, the
What's
way
the
I'm looking
what's
at it is when I ran 11:19, that took 21 minutes off my previous best time. So if I can get another 20, then I'll be under. We'll find out how sound that reasoning is in a few weeks, I guess.
what would the pace be on that? What's the per mile pace on that?
It's like about 6:35. So the way I'll go about that is I'll probably target a little closer to 6:30 or maybe 6:30 to 6:32, because that'll account for any potential like stoppages, like to use the bathroom or anything like that. And if I can get really comfortable running 6:30, 6:32 pace and just, hold on to that for dear life, I think what'll likely happen is I'm pretty confident I can get through 80 miles at that without too much risk. It'll just come down to whether I can keep that pedal at that level for that final 20 miles.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Half of it is.
I wonder. I was going to say, I wonder what, do they have any tracks that aren't 400-meter tracks, like a longer, like a horse track or something like that, where you could do something with less turns, I wonder?
Yeah, they're actually talking about that. There's a race organization out here in Arizona that puts on a ton of events, and they're looking at doing, I think they were looking at a spot in Vegas that was essentially like a racetrack, like a
Yeah,
car
like a
racetrack.
like a car racetrack would
Yep.
that
So
would
it's like
be,
banked and it's a mile.
yeah.
Uh, and then they were going to do some, they're planning something where they want to try to get like a lot of folks there and target, like essentially just have like a record chasing event where they chase records at 50K, 80K, 100K, 100 miles and all that stuff. So they were loosely targeting this year originally, but then with the Olympic trials marathon being this last weekend, this is the time of year they want to do it too, because obviously when you're chasing times, you want to be paying attention to weather. You can't have it getting up to like 80, 90 degrees or no one's going to be able to like give their maximal effort. So you need a time of year where it's like maybe the high of 70 or even 60 would be even better, so that people can have a realistic shot at doing it. And so it'd be this time of year, probably somewhere desert area. And with the Olympic trials being this year, they wanted to make sure they had an opportunity to maybe get some of those guys and gals to do it. And in order to do that, they had to make sure they weren't treading on the trials. So they're likely going to do something like that at this time next year, I think.
Stephen is asking, how do you ease back into training after a long race? Do you take days off? When do you restart running? I think I know that you're eating steak now afterwards. It's kind of, you figure out maybe our persistent hunter ancestors ran and then they
Yeah.
caught steak and then they ate it for a while before they needed to do it again. I don't know if that's the best way, but what are your thoughts on how to ease back into it after a race?
Yeah, the way I kind of do it is I essentially, if it's an A race, meaning it's one where I'm really trying to nail, and usually I'll do about two or three of those a year. And those events, they're going to end at the end of a training cycle. So I have some built-in time for kind of recovery and rebuild up after that before I'm like heading into my next peak event. So for those, like usually give myself at least a week where like I don't do really anything other than some light walking, maybe I'll bike to the grocery store or something like that. But like I'm doing very little in the terms of structured training of any kind and focusing primarily on recovery and, like Sean said, eating a lot of meat. Usually after a big event like that, it's not uncommon that I'm 2-3 pounds lighter. So like, a lot of times I'm overeating just to kind of gain back some of that weight I lost during the event itself. Uh, and then, usually after the first week, I've kind of normalized that side of things. And then I might start doing some kind of light jogging. I won't structure it usually in the second week where I'm forcing myself to do a specific time, a specific intensity or anything like that. I'll just go and start feeling out where my legs are at. And then after about a week of that, I usually kind of have a good idea of whether I'm ready to start training or not. I'm kind of focusing on kind of two things, both physical recovery and then mental recovery. Because one thing that you can sometimes do is you feel good enough to start running physically, but you're just not really mentally ready to wrap your head around another training cycle. So the risk there is you start the training cycle and you get like 6 weeks in and you realize you just weren't ready for it and you just end up wasting a lot of time kind of having to step back. So it is good to make sure you're ready and excited to do that. So one thing I kind of do to help with that too is I'll switch up kind of what I'm doing a lot. So instead of just doing the same types of events year in and year out, I'll do like half the year I'll be targeting something flatter and faster, and the other half the year I might target something that's a little more trail or mountain based. And that kind of helps with the mental refresh side because the way you train for those are different enough. It just is a little more exciting to kind of go into like a mountain training plan after you've done a flat, fast training plan and vice versa.
All right, let's see if there's anybody else that has a question here. Some people saying they could only hold that pace for about 10 seconds or something. I ran a 5-minute mile plate pace the other day for like, I don't know, 45 seconds relatively comfortably. So you'd probably be surprised what you can do for short distances. But yeah, when it gets beyond, I don't know, about a couple minutes, then it really starts to pick in. How fast do you run? And I know you do some speed work. How fast do you take those down as far as pace? Do you ever do like sub 5-minute mile stuff for a while, or what do you do?
Yeah. Usually, like the furthest I'll usually go where I'm dipping like any significant margin under a 5-minute mile pace is usually if I'm doing like kilometer repeats, which tend to be right around 3 minutes for me, a little under. When I get to the end of like, I'll do a phase of training earlier in my training plan where I'm doing these 3 minute intervals that I kind of mentioned before. And when I get to the end of that and start really kind of adapting to that style of training, I'm usually running kind of in the high 440 range for those kilometer repeats. Now it's only 1,000 meters, so I'm not even going a full mile. I'm doing like maybe a 2-3 minute recovery jog in between. Then I'm usually phasing up into like a phase of training where I'm working on an intensity that I could tolerate for maybe 60 minutes if I were to do an all out kind of time trial at that. And those paces usually tend to be kind of low to mid 5 minute per mile range. So I'm building up volume kind of within that framework. And then like I move into a system where it's like I usually kind of call it kind of like a base phase or like a maximum aerobic function type of phase of training where I'm hitting an intensity where it's still mostly aerobic, but it tends to be right around kind of maybe a little faster than kind of flat 100-mile intensity. And then I'm just building up volume and that, so I'm ready for the mechanics and the intensity of race day. So it's always kind of like working towards goal race environment and intensity. And that means the faster stuff tends to be in the beginning, because at no point during an ultra marathon should I be running a sub 5 minute mile if I want to be feeling good near the end. So I joke around though, like about going out to track and just seeing what I can do a mile in. It's been such a long time. I haven't raced a mile since high school. So like I've gone, I think 4:39 is the fastest I've done any one just open 1600 in. So I think I could go faster than that if I gave myself like 4 to 6 weeks, maybe, just to like fine tune training towards that. But it's hard because you see like there's so many different distances that you could train for, and ultimately you have to pick one. And I tend to be a little better at the 100-mile stuff than the 1-mile stuff. So usually that's where my energies end up.
One other question, Zach. Somebody's asked about your other competitors. Are you finding that the majority of your competitors are still using the high carb paradigm, or is there starting to be a shift?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's definitely a shift where I think if you went back even 10 years, be hard pressed to find anyone doing anything but high carb. So you're getting folks that are maybe a little more strategic about their stuff, who are paying a little more attention to nutrition, that are starting to kind of like play around with it. I wouldn't be able to tell you like a percentage or anything like that. I don't know if they've polled or anything, but I know this year they do a top 10 list in North America for like ultra running performances, and they basically rank your season, and it's voting based on like people who are like media sources within the sport, race directors and things like that. And this year there were 3 guys on the men's top 10 list that follow a high fat, low carb type of an approach similar to mine. So, you wouldn't have seen any a decade ago. So I think that probably shows that there's more people thinking about it. And then ironically enough, the guy who was 11th place, who just missed the top 10, is probably the strictest out of all. So we actually had him on HPO, Mike McKnight, and he does like super long ultras, like 200, 240 mile type stuff. So for him, I think it makes a ton of sense. And he's kind of been doing that for the last few years as well. So if 4 people in the top 11 is, I think, a pretty good indication that with ultra endurance stuff, it's starting to catch on a little more than it has in the past. Then I guess it's, there's enough, usually the governor, or not the governor, but the thing I look for is like, well, what products are available for that lifestyle? Because you can kind of tell, like, the market kind of dictates where the demand is. So, or responds to the demand. So like if you see a lot more kind of high fat, low carb products being available, it means a lot more people are probably entertaining the idea of it, doing it and playing around with it. So even like some sports fueling type strategies have gotten popular over the last decade or so that are more kind of high fat, low carb, keto friendly type stuff. So that tells me there's people out there who want that, and that must mean that it's moving that direction at least. But the majority of people are still doing I would say moderate carb, where it's ultra runners are kind of goofy. A lot of them tend to be like a little more kind of like free spirited, I would say. So they're not really thinking about this stuff too much. I mean, you'd think they'd be thinking of everything, but they're just not. And my theory is that like they're following a moderate carb approach to nutrition, because if you walk into a grocery store and just blindfold yourself and pick random things off the shelf, you're probably going to end up with moderate protein, or I'm sorry, moderate carbohydrate, kind of like lowish protein, probably 10% or less, and then like maybe 20-30% coming from like fat. And that's just what people would just pick if they had randomly like just grabbed stuff off the shelf. So that's basically what ultramarathon runners are doing on their day-to-day nutrition, from what I gather. So I think that's probably why that is what it is. I mean, it certainly helps that the language and the literature are still probably going to promote a high carb approach or a moderate carb approach. So if they do take it seriously, even then they're probably first stepping into that. And then if that doesn't work for them, they're playing around. It gets interesting though, too, because they just did a big study on kind of ultramarathon endurance. I don't know if it was recent, but it was fairly recent. And they said like 60% of ultramarathon endurance athletes reported some sort of stomach distress during their event. And, 60% that's worse than a coin flip's chance that you're going to have your race affected negatively by digestion. So when people have those experiences time and time again, they start to get a little more open-minded about how do I problem solve that. So I think that lends itself to a high-fat, low-carb approach, because you're just not fueling as much in a race when you're following an approach like that. So you're minimizing the potential to have stomach distress. So a lot of the people who come to me for coaching and advice, they're coming from that angle. They're like, well, my last 200-mile races, I spent the last 30 miles stopping every 4 minutes and puking up my nutrition, or stopping and using the bathroom 20 some times in the last 20 miles or something like that. Ridiculous stuff. And they realize like how much work, effort, and money goes into preparing for something like that, and they don't necessarily want like a stomach issue to be the reason why they weren't able to achieve their goal. And then they get a little more open-minded, I think.
Well, awesome, Zach. Well, we've kept you for an hour. This is usually when we kind of shut it down, so I think it's been very helpful. Thank you so much for coming on, Zach.
Yeah.
Obviously, I get to hear this stuff with you quite a bit. So we have a runners group at Meet RX. There's a meeting that it happens on I think Thursdays or something. We have a running group, and then we've got a diabetes group coming on in a little bit, and then Carl points out that the running can be a part of healthy aging. So
yeah, I'm banking on it.
Yeah, hopefully. All right. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much, Zach. I'm sure I'll see you fairly soon. I can't remember when our next HBO is, but I'm sure it's coming up soon. And I will see everybody else here otherwise tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. I'm going to end the meeting. Take care, guys. Take care.
Great to meet everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.